by each of the panelists giving us a short talk on their thoughts on the question for today's panel, which is how individuals can promote and encourage lasting and positive change. By each of the panelists giving us a, I hear myself on YouTube, amazing. So how we can encourage positive and lasting change around sustainability and environmental policy. So if you have any thoughts on that already, feel free to post them in the chat if you have any questions. And our panelists, like I said, will be each giving a short talk, and then we'll start the discussion. So for the discussion, we'll be taking questions from the chat, and also later on, we'll open the questions up to the audience. So if you want to speak, you can raise your hand using the raise hand function, which you can find in the participants section on Zoom. And yeah, we want to make this as kind of interactive as possible. So feel free to anytime post in the chat. And beyond that, I think that's all of the admin. If you don't see all the speakers on the screen right now, at the top right-hand corner of whichever it is, you can find the gallery mode, and that will enable you to see everybody that is audio turned on. So enable that so that you can see everybody that has the video on to make the panel a bit easier to watch. And yeah, I think that's it. Also, so you probably know about CUSPE if you've joined, but CUSPE is the Cambridge University's Science and Policy Exchange, which is an organization run by students and early career researchers. And our main goal is to build stronger links between our members and government policymakers. So today's day is the second day of our forum conference, which is an annual conference. And this year we decided to do it on the topic of sustainability. And CUSPE attracts academics from a wide array of disciplines, and we all kind of want to understand how our own research or science more generally fits within kind of a policy context more broadly. And feel free to subscribe to our newsletter or follow us on any of the social media channels to know more about different events that we host. So we host workshops, lectures, interactive kind of career panels and so on. And our last day of the forum is tomorrow, where we're going to be talking about the role of academia in shaping a sustainable future, and also a careers event where you can network with different policy making kind of internships and so on. So feel free to register and turn up for that if you're interested. Okay, so I think we have a fair number of people on the Zoom link. So perhaps we can start off. So our first speaker today is Emily Bolton from the Cambridgeshire City Council. And Emily joined the Cambridgeshire City Council in 2018, supporting the council's implementation of renewable energy schemes. And during this time, she's helped develop and draft the council's plastic strategy and climate change and environment strategy, both of which outline the council's approach to dealing with these kind of issues. And in April 2020, she moved to the role of climate change officer. So now she's responsible for the implementation of the council's climate policy. And Emily's work currently focuses on organizational change to reduce the carbon impact of the council's services. So the provision of electric vehicle charging infrastructure and developing funding mechanisms to enable investment into nature-based carbon sequestration and biodiversity net gain projects, which has also included working with CUSPE 2020 project team. So Emily, if you'd like to take it away with your presentation.
Hi, yes. So as Simone just said, one of the key things that I've been working on recently has been the development of the Council's climate change and environment strategy. And this was really our response to our declaration of a climate and environment emergency in May 2019. And so I want to share some of my thoughts and experience from actually trying to get input from individuals into this strategy. So one of the things we did was to hold a consultation on the first draft. And this was specifically not just aimed at our other partners and businesses, but open to individuals as well, because we know that people are very, very passionate and have a lot to contribute on this issue, but we don't necessarily hear about it. And so this, we felt, was a key opportunity for individuals to influence the approach that the council takes. And actually going through this process showed me where some of our existing mechanisms, I think, are struggling a little bit. Now, some of this is for the council to work on. And, you know, things like a greater use of social media, public talks, and sort of generally taking a more discursive approach when we speak to our communities. are all coming forward as an acknowledgement of the fact that we need to engage better. But this will only go so far. Engagement is a two-way street, and we can talk to you all we want, but we need to hear back. And this is where we struggled on our climate change strategy. We saw the climate youth strikes take place throughout the end of 2019, with young people coming to our offices in Cambridge. And during these events, councillors and officers spoke to the groups to listen and understand their perspective. Now, this did have a really strong influence on our approach to the strategy, which was under development at the time, particularly around targeting our consultation process to young people to get a better handle on their views. So as a result, we went to schools and other community groups to discuss the strategy, listen to views, and really encourage young people to take an active role in responding and helping shape our strategy. However, we needed this to be done through a formal process to enable the responses to be kept properly recorded and understood. We must have spoken to over 100 students across the county, many of whom were part of eco groups at their schools. However, despite all of this, out of the 400 responses to our consultation, only 3 of these were from anyone under the age of 24. So you see, active engagement is needed from both sides. And we know, as I've said, that there are people with strong views, but we still do not see those people actively engaging with the processes we have in place. Admittedly, they might not be ideal processes, but they exist and are there. Indeed, even when we saw the Extinction Rebellion youth group, who in Cambridge were particularly vocal and set out clear demands of the council earlier this year, they closed down dialogue by not engaging and responding to the council's written response to them in a meaningful way. And as an officer who was involved in bringing up the climate issues and putting together that response, I personally saw this as a really big missed opportunity. That dialogue would enable us to understand better the views and the nuances behind them. Collectively, individuals really can make a difference, but we need to hear your views first and in a way that enable us to act. What we quite often see outside of sort of these formalized approaches, such as the surveys or consultations, is asks for us to do more, be bolder, be more ambitious. And these are great, and it puts into context the type of action individuals want to see, but these are subjective and do require interpretation. For example, what would be bold enough? How does the council know we are delivering on those demands? If you speak in tangible actions, there can be a really powerful message there, and it enables us to better work on the delivery of things that individuals want to see, while also balancing the demands across the whole range of other pressures the council faces, especially when resources are limited. So I would really encourage, as a starting point, to engage with these existing processes and to enable individuals to input on policy and climate action. Don't do this don't protest, for example, at the expense of taking part in these systems and mechanisms we have in place. Do it as well. And this is a really useful way at your disposal now to influence policy in a meaningful way as it develops. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Emily, for your talk. Now maybe perhaps we can have Philip from the Sortition Foundation give us his response to the panel question. So Philip is the co-director of the Sortition Foundation, and he's involved with the promotion and execution of randomly selected citizens' assemblies in the UK and also outside the UK. And his work on establishing Greater Cambridge Citizens' Assembly on transport congestion and air quality was rewarded with the Vice Chancellor's Social Impact Award from the university. And Philip regularly advises politicians, policymakers, and others on how to engage citizens on various environmental issues using randomly selected deliberative mini-publics. So hopefully he'll tell us more about how these citizens' assemblies work.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I'll share some slides with you. And if someone of you could just nod at me to tell me that you were seeing this.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Well, first of all, thanks very much, Emily. This was very insightful, and I've taken many notes, and I'm going to respond to some of what you said just a minute ago because I thought that was very interesting. Before that, I'm going to just briefly present what I think should be done to encourage and involve individuals in positive and lasting change. Just briefly, as I was just introduced, my name is Verpoort. I'm a co-director of the Sortition Foundation. I am also doing a PhD in physics at the university at the moment, and soon enough, hopefully, handing in my dissertation. Yeah, thanks very much to the organizers for putting up this event. So coming back to the question, so the question of today's panel or today's event is how can individuals be encouraged to play a role in positive and lasting change? Now, I'm going to slightly reinterpret that question and ask, how can people be involved? How can individuals be involved in that type of change? And I'm going to respond, well, that could be done through a so-called citizens' assembly. And some of you may have heard that term, some of you may have not. And I'm going to introduce that and explain how that works and why this makes sense in this context. But just briefly, what is a citizens' assembly to begin with? It is a group of randomly selected people from the wider population. They meet up over a couple of weekends to discuss a specific policy issue, listen to some experts, give their advice, ask questions, elaborate is the technical term, and then in the end come up with recommendations. So these could be policy recommendations or more general recommendations to policymakers and politicians. That's a general process. These are a lot of words. I'm just going to show some pictures because we all know a picture tells you more than 1,000 words. On the top left, sorry, you can see a group of people randomly selected from the wider population. They're very diverse. They represent as much as possible for that small group the wider diversity of the citizens who they meant to represent. On the top right, you'll see people then engaging in deliberation. So they talk to each other, they listen to each other, which is quite important. They discuss policy options and evidence that they receive. And on the bottom picture, you'll see someone, an expert, presenting information to them. So that's a very important aspect of this. And these are the three key, to my mind, the three main important aspects of this process. It's sortition, which we've got in our name, as you may have realized, which this is the random selection of participants, the deliberation, which is the weighing up arguments in a respectful environment, listening to other people, and finally receiving and discussing balanced information. Now, to give you an example what this looks like, one of the processes we worked on as Sortition Foundation was Climate Assembly UK. It was a project commissioned by the House of Commons. In fact, 6 select committees from the House of Commons. It was on the question, how should the UK meet its target of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050? And what should that path be to reach net zero emissions? It had roughly 110 participants. It was conducted over 6 weekends, partly online, partly offline due to COVID-19. And the results were just published earlier in September. Now, this is one example of such a process. It's basically about a hard policy problem. You want to implement policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but of course, you kind of want to involve individuals, you want to involve citizens in making those decisions. So what you do is you invite this random group that is supposed to kind of represent everyday people from all walks of life, and you give them time and access to expert advice so that they can then tell you in the end what they think should be done about climate change. And there have been a lot of examples like this. We're currently running another process like this with the Scottish Parliament. And there's a couple of local events happening with local councils in either in cities or in smaller districts across the UK and also in other countries. And just by the way, in case you haven't noticed, well, and I must say, in fact, unfortunately, not too many people are aware of this fact, but there was also such a project in Cambridge called the Greater Cambridge Citizens Assembly on the question of how do we reduce congestion, improve air quality, and provide better public transport in Greater Cambridge. That was exactly that type of process, trying to solve the question of congestion and transport, and how we get cars off the road and improve cycling, improve public transport, etc., and involve people in making that decision. And that ended in October last year. Now, these are just some examples. I've now bombarded you with some information about how this process works and how and what the examples are. I'm going to just quickly try to explain again, why do we need this in the first place? Why should you care that I just told you there's a bunch of random people meeting up to discuss a policy issue? Here's a few reasons why. First of all, people will trust the decisions or the recommendations made by this assembly, because these are decisions made by people like you and me. They're not, policy makers or politicians who are very well educated and in a privileged position, but they're rather people like you and me who have to live the same life and therefore experience what other policies are going to be in the same way. It's effective. People usually say there's all these new problems coming up, especially environmental problems. So we need other methods of tackling them, other methods that work alongside the elected parliamentary politics that we have in place. It's informed because it works with expert advice. It's deliberative. People are doing this kind of careful weighing up of options in a respectful environment, and it's transparent. The public can kind of watch the whole process happen, and a lot of it is made as transparent as possible through live streaming and so on, putting all the information out there so anyone can check what happens inside. I'm just going to briefly show this graph to explain it a little bit more, because before I stop, because I think I'm running out of time. This is the traditional model that we're currently working with. Experts give advice to politicians, and they're trying to explain the whole thing to citizens. This works really badly at delivering policies that are based on evidence, because politicians don't normally have their campaigns based on expert advice. It's usually much easier to have an emotional story that's based on strong leadership and I don't know, talking about stability and God knows what, rather than saying, okay, these are the facts that some experts, some scientists just told me we have to do, and I'm now going to implement that. That's just unfortunately not a story that sells particularly well to the wider public. On the other hand, you might then say, well, then citizens just have to get informed so that they're going to elect the right politicians. But also that doesn't really work, because citizens suffer from something called rational ignorance. So the perceived benefit of actually getting informed about, say, climate policy or something to then make the right choice in your election is just so small, because you're just one person in a couple of million making that decision in your election. So long story short, that model doesn't work very well. And the idea is we're going to exchange this to some extent by that model, where we say the politicians are going to convene a citizens' assembly. The members are going to be drawn by lot from the wider population, and that assembly then receives expert advice from scientists, say. And what we receive back from this is that the citizens' assembly makes recommendations to the politicians, tells them, you should do this, this, and this, and it creates trust with the citizens, who will then see, okay, so this advice that was put forward by the Citizens Assembly, it was made by people like you and me. So I trust it, even though I might not fully understand it. That was just a very, very brief summary of kind of my theory behind why we're doing this, and why I encourage people to work with a model like this more often. And that's the end of my presentation. Thanks very much for listening and for your attention. And I'll hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Philip. And now next we have Eugenie Dugwal from LSE. And if I just had prepared what I was going to say, Dr. Eugenie Dugwal is an assistant professor in environmental economics at the London School of Economics in the Department of Geography and Environment. And she's also affiliated with the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics. And she has a PhD in sustainable development from the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, and she got that in 2018. And her dissertation focused on the economics of the environment and technological change. As an environmental economist, Dr. Dugoua works on topics at the intersection of environmental issues and innovation and technological change. And her research interests lie primarily in understanding how policies and, more broadly speaking, institutions can influence innovation in sciences. So, Eugenie, if you want to take it away.
Yes, thanks a lot for the introduction, and thank you very much for this opportunity to engage with people from outside academia. It's precious as it is rare. So I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion afterwards. So you gave us a question, and I have to say it's a pretty hard question to answer from the point of view of social science, right? Your question is, how can individuals encourage positive and lasting change around sustainability issues? And the reason why I'm saying, a bit ironically, right, that it's hard for social scientists to answer that question is because social scientists like to think about bigger things than individual, right? We like to think about institutions, or how group of individuals together make society and put together like a policy agenda. So the economist in me would start by positioning the individual somewhere as part of a demand curve and saying, well, the reason why we have a lot of environmental issues is because our consumption or our production processes are causing these pollutions. So as a consumer, you can actually do something, right? You can try to be an activist consumer, and but of course not. This answer is not really doesn't give me great satisfaction. It has a lot of limits. People don't have infinite purchasing power. Typically, the things that are maybe greener may also be more expensive. And a much more fundamental argument is that a lot of the problems that we have are really need collective action solutions. So there are problems that are easier solved than others. And if you want to think about environmental problems that are mostly at the local level or at the national level, they're very hard to solve. But they're still easier to solve than problems like climate change or biodiversity or even plastic pollution, which all have this international dimensions that make them extremely complicated to solve. So, I would rephrase the question as, how can individuals contribute to, or help international cooperation in a way? Because if this is really what's going to be the game changer, what can we do about that? Of course, if you're an American citizen, you can matter a great deal, right? Because at that point, if you're in or out of the Paris Accord, and we can debate what the Paris Accord does or doesn't do, but it's a beginning. If the US is out of it, it is not good sign. It's not a good sign at all. All right, so maybe most of you are not American citizens. So as European citizen, what can we do as people like British citizen? So I think one thing that is important is to realize that countries have made pledges, so maybe we can do something to hold these people accountable, to remind them, to keep the debate, that question really very hot in the public debate. Governments all around the world, right? And that is going to be true in the UK, but also in the global South or in China. We're all facing that issue. And so actually it's a problem. It's a matter of keeping public opinion on and hot on these topics across a range of countries that have their own institutions and their own dynamics. So then I was trying to think about, if the goal is really to help environmental policies, what can we do as individuals? And so that prompted me to think about, two aspects of, I guess, environmental policies. Economists like to think about them as benefits and costs. environmental policies have a cost. It may be more expensive to use some technologies to reduce emission, but they definitely, you would be willing to pay this cost because you get a lot of benefits out of it. So I guess the first individual action that would help here is, like, if you want to be an entrepreneur, if you're interested in engineering and technology as well, you can pursue a career here. If you have an idea that actually would reduce emissions, just go help the world reduce the cost of abatement. Okay, because at this point, the cheaper it gets to abate emission, and the easier it's going to be to have politicians implement whatever they have to implement. Of course, if you're not at all an engineer, you're still a consumer, and maybe you have some purchasing power. So actually there, you can play the role of the early adopter, okay? The guy that's willing to buy a Tesla, and maybe you don't like Elon Musk, but there are other products, right, that actually are cutting edge, but very expensive because they're at the beginning, and there are a lot of economists say that you have a lot of externalities in adopting new technologies. At the beginning, we don't quite know how to use them, but the first guys, the early adopters, are going to provide a lot of learning, positive externalities to the rest of us. All right, so we may not all be able to reduce costs. We may not have a budget constraint that fits, buying expensive technologies. So I think really it boils down to this issue of the public debate and making sure that governments notice that the issue will not go away. Public opinion plays a huge role. The Paris Agreement is basically a role, like a sort of expectations game. So if everyone expects that things are going to happen, it puts pressure on everyone, but it's somehow nobody expects anything to happen. Nothing's going to happen, right? So we should not provide good arguments to our governments to not do anything. They have to understand the issue is at the heart of democratic debates. So the question is, what do we do about public opinions? And so I was really interested in hearing, what the two previous panelists have had to say, because it really actually gets to that aspect about talking to citizens. I really think my key message here is that we need informed citizens. That is the basis of engaging with these issues within the public debate. So people need to be educated. They need to, they're gonna have to learn something. They may have to hear from experts. They may have to hear from other people that may or not be experts, but we need to get the facts right, and that all over the world. And an important message that I have here is that I think the challenge here is to steer clear from ideology. I think these issues are very complicated. It's sometimes easy to stop thinking because they're really complicated and just start, using some ideological fallback mechanism that we have to understand the world and to simplify the world. So it's not a problem that easy to solve. And I don't think we are we're not in this situation today because of any particular ideology. There will be, so these problems are complicated to solve, and we're going to try to solve them. I think many people now are aligned on that objective, but it's also true. So, the climate science is a complex science, but the economics and the policy making of green transitions is maybe even more complicated. So many errors are going to be made, many mistakes, right, are going to be made by policymakers. And that's normal because we're all in this big, massive experiment, and we're not quite sure exactly how to get to where we want to go. So I think what I wanted to say here is we want to encourage anyone who's trying to do the right things, even if they are not getting it 100% right. We should not blame them for not getting things 100% right. We need to stay inclusive. So I'm not naive. I know there are special interests. And whenever there are special interests that are blocking the debate and polluting the debate, we need to point at them. But I think it's not productive to antagonize, the polluting sectors, for example, oil and gas. So I'm one person that would argue that it is important to keep oil and gas inside that debate. It is true that sometimes they may be playing a double game, and whenever that happens, if they're obstructing the facts and the truth, for example, then we need to point fingers at them, and they need to be held accountable to the, to fake news or any kind of non-fact that they may be basing their defense on. So to finish, I think the quality of the public debate is really important. I'm not, an expert on public debate, but I think from my view as a person in academia trying to think about the facts and the mechanism behind these big problems, I think it's really important to maintain the conversation and the debate on what is objective as much as possible. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Eugenie. And now finally, our final speaker is Chidi Obihara. So he's a former banker and derivatives consultant who ran for parliament and served on the National Executive of the Green Party of England and Wales. And his activism is driven by both his ancestral links to the Niger Delta, so witnessing firsthand the environmental destruction and devastation brought by multinationals like Shell Oil, and his political and professional understanding of the massive changes in economics, finance and politics that are required to make a system that is to deliver truly sustainable development for all. So Chidi, if you'd like to give your presentation. I think I have your slides, so let me just show my screen. Share. Is that happening? Cool. Chidi, I think you're muted.
Thank you. I've just been talking to myself for about 30 seconds. Thank you so much, Simone. Thanks for that. And also thank you to my previous speakers, my fellow panelists. I thought that all of you made really excellent points. And obviously the point of debate is that we have to differ on a couple of things. But I think that what's super important if you're going to have a debate or discussion about the role the individual plays is to map out the role that I've played for at least a small part of my speech, so that I can show that to a large extent, I've tried to lead, as it were, by example. So a good place to look across social media is my Instagram page, green_Chidi, for anybody who is curious to find out what the journey has been like. What you can see now is just the introductory page that discusses sort of who I am. But the next slide is a really important one. Can we move on to that, please, Simone? And that is that at the very heart of what we're talking about when we discuss the environmental constraints that sit in the middle of the challenges that fossil fuel industries bring, or that ecological collapse brings, are that these things have basic human rights implications. They have a history that has created them, so this problem has a context, and they have solutions which XR, an organization of which I'm a member, is desperately keen to highlight and solve. I think that's a really important part of what individuals need to try and do within the context of the way that we live, where we live, the time and place that we're in. It's really important for everybody out there to go out there and literally or metaphorically find your tribe. Find groups of people who feel very strongly about the things that you feel strongly about and join with them so that you can magnify your voice. And so my first slide, as it were, is just an indication of a demonstration that XR did outside Shell headquarters here in London, celebrating the 25th anniversary of the murder of environmentalists. Other individuals trying to do their best in Nigeria. Now, believe it or not, 25 years ago, Ken Saro-Wiwa was murdered by the Nigerian government with the support of multinationals who were doing their best to keep the status quo, an unsustainable and inequitable status quo, but that was what they were trying to do, and that's what individuals have to stand up against. The next slide, please. And so, and this in a way speaks to Eugenie's points and some of the assumptions that she made. I'm not sure I followed it completely, but I got the impression she was saying that there is no ideological or, if you like, political basis on which we can discuss issues of pollution or issues of environmental degradation or issues of a lack of sustainability. And I differ with that, absolutely. And also on my Instagram page is a chat I had with Roger Hallam, one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion, where we talk about the nature of the political economy of pollution and the things that individuals need to understand and do to bring positive change. Next slide, please. And within the context of those individuals, and it is unfortunate, in my opinion, sometimes we get the debate structured in this way, where you have individuals on one side and the state or the corporation on the other, slightly atomized debate and unnecessarily dichotomous. You don't have to be on either side, because I think, as is obvious, that individuals collectively make up corporations and governments and nation states. But if we're going to focus on individual choice, we need to focus on these R's. We need to rethink our broad choices within our current political economy. We need to refuse to create refuse. We need to stop being single use about the things in our lives. There's no such thing as away. You can't throw stuff away. You really should think about the implications of your consumption, and reducing your consumption is definitely something you can do as an individual that helps. Reusing things, so you reduce your carbon footprint, you reduce your consumption footprint, you reduce the impact you have on the environment in general, is always a good thing to do. And it's relatively old-fashioned, but refurbishing, repairing, and repurposing things that you have, so that you don't have to buy 12 sets of clothes every year. You can easily do with one or two, and lead just as high a quality of life. Consumption in and of itself is not good for the environment. Next slide, please. Excellent. And so within the context of being an activist, and within the context of working with organizations like XR, my background being in banking, there have been some really knotty policy issues. And these are incredibly important, right? Because they talk about ways of adjusting the way the market works, so that it doesn't encourage or reward pollution, excessive consumption, over or single use, or the destruction of the environment for profit. And within that context, there's a whole bunch of policy issues that are being discussed by politicians everywhere. And it's super important for individuals, if you're going to try and help envisage this new world, if you're going to try and help give birth to a new way of thinking, to find out in whatever area you choose what the policy issues are, and contribute to that. I noted Emily saying at the beginning of this that she tried to touch base with XR Cambridge, and she was able to make progress. In other words, she was able to get them to come and sit at the table and discuss follow-up steps to the climate change emergency that have been declared. And Emily, I'm offering you now to try and make that work for you. If you still are willing to chat to XR people about policy options and actions, I could easily make the connection. But I think that ability to make our own individual connections to the governments or the corporations that we are part of, to use the knowledge that we have to support policies that impact and change the way our society works, is of pivotal importance. It's crucially important. And that's obviously my last slide. So if we could go back to me, I'd be grateful, Simone.
Just stop the thing. Yeah. Oh.
That's cool. I have a few more minutes, so I want to try and have a discussion based on factual and important steps individuals can take. I think the number one step you take is that you do pay attention to your individual consumption choices, and with everything that we do, with the dietary choices that we make, with the car we drive, the choice of transport we make, the number of clothes we buy, the way that we dress, all of those choices that we make have an impact on the environment around us. But what is really crucial is that it's slightly lazy for policymakers to defer all of the responsibility for a malfunctioning system that malprices pollution, to defer all of that responsibility to the individual. Because we know that the supply side structures of our current social, political, and economic frameworks, many of those supply side structures contribute to a problem that they actually created. And I'll give you one example of so many. I'm hoping that Eugenia can support me on this, which is that, last year, as we watched ever increasing fires across Amazonia, and supporters of people like Bolsonaro turn a blind eye to the theft of land from indigenous Brazilian communities, We also saw trade deals being set up between the EU and Merco and a group of South American countries. Now, within that context, it's super important to be aware, and this is something that I campaigned on, it's super important to be aware that if you have governments and corporations that make it profitable for people to engage in large-scale deforestation in order to plant soy, or in order to plant feed for cattle, or just make land available for cattle, for beef, we're setting ourselves up to have an unsustainable trade-off. The idea that we can lose the majority of the Earth's forest cover in exchange for cheaper hamburgers, that is a lie, and that is unfair, because it's unsustainable, and it's based on an informational, a democratic, and a political decision-making process that doesn't tell the truth to everyone concerned about what sustainability means, about what the path of humanity is, and what the destination is that we're heading for in this period of Earth's history that we're calling the Anthropocene. Now, some of you may know about the Paris Agreement, some of you may know that we have carbon budgets that affect the way that we behave. And for those of you who do know that, you'll easily understand what I mean when I say that within the context of contemporary finance in the West, there are lots of things going on to try to make sure that the externalities created by irresponsible business behavior are actually priced into the market. There are lots of things making sure that those externalities get priced appropriately so that we create systems-based disincentives to pollution. One of those things is a campaign for climate financial disclosure, the task force for climate financial disclosure called the TCFD. We've been pushing banks and other large-scale businesses to disclose their full carbon footprint. Now, this kind of audit is super important, right? Because while we as individuals can make all of these smaller changes on our part, we need large-scale supply-side organizational governments to actually create an informational base, to be able to create a society where we can make effective choices. In summary, the individual cannot make a big enough difference if the corporate and governmental structures around them don't give them correct and full information, and don't give them choices and options that allow them to avoid unsustainable social, business, and political choices. So in summary, I'd like to thank you guys all very much for your previous comments. I see a lot that we agree on, and obviously there are areas in which we don't agree. But I think it's profoundly important to recognize this particular period, this time and place, as a pivotal. That there hasn't been a generation that has had the ability to challenge supply-side politics on this scale for a very long time. Environmentalists have won lots of wars, policy discussions, policy arguments over the decades. But the idea that environmentalists could get together, mobilize societies, both as individuals and groups, and challenge multinationals whose power appears virtually ubiquitous. The idea that we could have demonstrations where people force Shell to convert 10% of its current revenue to renewables rather than oil and gas, and that's happened already. The idea that this could happen 10 years ago would have been a pipe dream. So I'd like to end on that super optimistic note. I'd like to end on that note by sharing with you the idea that individual choices have forced corporations and governments to actually make a difference in the way that they do business. And it's that thing, that finding your tribe, forming a collective, moving forward. And I mean, for me, it goes without saying, but I think it has to be said, non-violent civil disobedience, the ability to write letters, the ability to speak out the truth to people is profoundly powerful. And individuals must always be reminded they have that power and they should use it responsibly. Thank you. That's it.
All right, thank you, Chidi, and thank you all for a really interesting introductory talks. I guess to get the kind of discussion started, you all have mentioned in different ways how it's really important to get different actors involved. So, whether it's citizens, becoming activists and kind of demonstrating or speaking to their local policymakers, like Emily was saying, or getting involved in the citizens' assemblies and so on, in all the ways that you mentioned. I guess, how can we ensure that communication and collaboration between those different levels exists, instead of everyone kind of waiting for everybody else to do something about it and kind of saying, well, these people are not coming to me, or I spoke about this and then nothing ever happened. And this was one of the themes that kind of came up in yesterday's chats that we had in the forum on kind of how we can ensure that we have that communication between, the scientists, government, policymakers, citizens, people who have different views and so on, to kind of enable the things that you all were saying are so needed. So maybe Emily, do you want to start us off with that?
Yes, I think to highlight this forum is a really great opportunity, particularly for from the science perspective and research to directly influence policy. Indeed, the CUSPE work that we've undertaken previously, last year's CUSPE 2019 project to develop a carbon footprint for Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, that is directly underpinning much of our policy action and our targets, and is being used through all sorts of different business groups, other political organizations, all sorts, to underpin and really provide us a sound evidence base for the action we want. And that is a really positive and really great thing that's happened that brings together those groups. I think where our challenge still remains is getting the individuals and finding that mechanism to enable the conversations between individuals and empowering them to feel that their view is being heard, recognizing, of course, that the individual perspective always has to be in the context of the collective response. We don't have a system in which if one person by themselves wants change, that isn't going to cut it. You need to have a collective group wanting it. And as Chidi put forward, finding your tribe is a great way of building that narrative and enabling and amplifying your view with others to get that message across. I think we perhaps need to develop or find a better mechanism. I don't have the answer to that at the moment, but I think that is a gap in how we go about and have these discussions.
Does any one of you want to respond to that?
Sure. I think Emily's been a bit modest there, actually, because listening to someone who works in local authority, who's working on climate change emergency, explain on a call like this in a policy forum that she's been reaching out to groups. That is, for me, that's a great sign of progress. That we're virtually there. I mean, Philippe also mentioned the fact that the Sortition Foundation has been facilitating the selection of randomly selected groups of individuals who are then fed expert information directly, so that they skip the sort of the heuristic, short-term, slightly narrow challenges that conventional politics has, and they make a broader, more robust, more inclusive, more embedded decision. I think those kinds of processes, policymakers reaching out, people assembling groups of people in a way that allows them to give feedback in a constructive way, those are wonderful mechanisms. And we just need more of the same. We need more of that. That's what I'd say.
Mm-hmm. Maybe Philip, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to make one comment about this. I mean, broadly, I really agree with everything that the other panelists have said, and I really appreciate Chidi's comments about individual action and demanding as activists and as citizens from our governments, from local councils, that they should do what has to be done. But I mean, partly perhaps also to contrast this with other views, other perspectives, because that's what a panel is about. But partly also because I really believe that this is an kind of incomplete picture of what has to happen. I think we already have a lot of very vocal voices from citizens who demand action. I think the problem is that we also have a lot of people who are very silent. I think that is the problem. And what we need to do is we need to include those people who never really say anything or get involved at all in policy making. Because I think, you know, the problem from the policymaker's perspective is, okay, I'm seeing, say, the 1% or say maybe 3% of people who are very loud, very vocal, have very strong demands and really want to completely change society. But perhaps 90% of people have no opinion at all. And I mean, you know, all these climate strikes and youth strikes and so on, I mean, they're amazing. And so many people went into the streets. But let's face it, even though at the global climate strike in September last year, even though there were a couple of million people in the streets around the world, across in different countries, that was still just maybe a few percent, probably less than 1% of the wider population. So while there are some parts of the population that are very vocal, there are so many people who just say nothing. And on top of that, we also get a lot of resistance from other groups, partly because they believe their jobs may be at risk. You know, that's why we see people like Trump winning elections saying, okay, I'm going to protect those jobs. Partly, that's one thing. We're also seeing people who say, hang on, I don't want to be told what I'm allowed to eat or how much meat I'm supposed to eat, or how cheap or expensive my meat is, or how much I can drive my car into the city, and so on and so forth. And we need to take those people on board, and we're not going to get anywhere. So, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm really supportive of individual action and of individuals demanding from their governments that something needs to happen. But unless we get those other people who are either resistant or uncertain, if we don't get them on board as well, then it's just going to end in a confrontation that in the end leads to immobilization, if that makes sense. Yeah.
There were a few questions about the Citizens Assembly specifically. So one of the questions that somebody from the YouTube stream had was actually on whether, when you reach out to people who are randomly selected, do certain groups of people, like, are they more likely to say yes and join in? And perhaps the people that are already not really interested in these issues or don't really care about it being engaged with policy, are you more likely, like, do you actually get a representative view of what's going on in society, or do you get that kind of skewed view of the people that would already be participating?
Yeah, I'm just going to quickly answer that question. So, of course, citizens' assemblies aren't perfect. You're not going to get a perfect representation of the public, but in the process generally is a lot better than normal types of consultations, in the sense that you will get people who normally are not involved in politics. We had some events where we had people, a large proportion of people who had never voted. We had events where people participated who just weren't concerned about climate change. So for Climate Assembly UK, the project I mentioned earlier in my slides, we made sure that the representation of people who were concerned about climate change and those who were not concerned accurately matched what we know people believe from polls, from public opinion polls in the country, so that when these people were then informed by experts who said, well, you know, this is the climate science and this is what has to happen, and you can decide whether either you want to, I don't know, drive less here or consume less there, and when they came up with recommendations in the end, nobody could challenge and say, but hang on, these were just a bunch of green activists sitting in a room together and having a chat. Actually, this was an accurate representation of the public.
And in terms of kind of bringing those expert ideas kind of into the public forum, let's say, maybe Eugenie, you want to weigh in on this, in terms of how to translate, you know, the so-called, like, the facts, or like what we know in what people might know as scientists or climate scientists, or even the kind of social sciences, as you were saying, kind of the environment, the economist, the economical side, and so on. How do we translate what might look good in terms of a research proposal or the kind of conclusions that might come from academia to then, you know, people knowing about this, the kind of people that, you know, will end up on something like a citizens assembly or making those individual decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I thought this citizen assembly are really fascinating, and I really would like to be a little mouth hidden and observe what's going on, right? And I really would like to talk to people before and after and see how they change their mind. I would like to understand how this kind of thing works for experts or doesn't work. I mean, I can see the potential for so many things going wrong, you know. It's hard to be an expert, right? And typically it's you have a hard time simplifying, although, you know, when you have to teach your material, that's a good practice, I think. I thought one thought I wanted to share on this graph, on the diagram that Philippe, you shared, is it seemed to be that maybe another bubble you could add is, you know, general public opinion, or like the public debate, or maybe social media, because this interaction, they sort of interact in the backdrop of you know, the overall yeah, the general feeling about like this particular topic, and politicians seems to be kind of very, unfortunately, I think, very responsive to that, because these are more sort of short term, or it's like sometimes the one that kind of is managed to scream the loudest, or, you know, so I mean, also sometimes it is about which company is able to better, you know, communicate about the idea, and they put a lot of money into that, and they can end up with very very smooth campaigns, right? So yeah, I really love the idea of citizen assembly. I really like it in particular because I was going to say, in terms of, you know, I think activism is super important, and I think movements like Extinction Rebellion, even if like I am not aligned 100% with what their you know, leaders are saying or how they are saying it, they are doing a service to society, because they just make the front page of newspapers. So they're putting that issue, you know, front and center, at least sometimes, not always, right? And you would want that issue to be front and center as often as possible. But the risk is that by being too radical, you are becoming fringe, right? And I think that's one challenge that people have hinted at, is like, you want to engage with the 95 other percent that all the people have never voted. I don't think the challenge is to get people to vote green, really, is to get politicians to understand that there's no other way to do politics going forward. It's not a Green Party or not Green Party. It's like we're gonna have to price in pollution, and so we're gonna have to have these policies that are gonna make some things more expensive. So that is creating some winners and losers, even for policies on air pollution, which you could think, you know, London air pollution. It's a very local problem. It's not a global public good. There's no you know, international environmental agreement needed for that. It's still just really difficult, because if you want to you know, be more stringent in terms of how people can use their cars, you have, you know, a lot of people that depend on their car to go you know, and get to their work quite far away, with long commuting trips and so on. Right, so let's not. I think what I want to say, there are winners and losers, and some of these issues, therefore, are going to be confrontational. And I think we may be able to bring in more people, but some people can't be brought in because they have something to lose.
So kind of following up on that, something that also came up, Eugenie, in your talk, and also Chidi mentioned as well, was this idea of whether or not we can make kind of environmental policy a non-partisan issue, something that everybody can kind of agree on the facts at least, and then because it affects us and we all have to deal with the consequences, that we should, you know, independent of the individual kind of political sentiments, we should all kind of agree that we should do something about it. But I guess one of the main challenges that I see with that is that obviously we can all agree what the problem is, but we're all going to have different ways of wanting to solve it, even if we all agree that we need a solution. So in terms of the challenges of that, maybe Chidi, do you want to weigh in?
Thank you so much for that, Simone. That was excellently framed, because it gives me a chance to engage with Eugene actually on a couple of the points that she just made. So, I mean, Eugene has a great theoretical grasp of many of the issues that she's talking about. And it's always good to have academic input into these things. But I think that there are some things that I would challenge, or at least ask her to think in a bit more detail about. One of them was the assertion she just made that clean air is not a global public good. And I disagree with that in an absolute sense. The nature and the state of our atmosphere is something that we share across the globe. The Keeling curve that talks about the amount of carbon dioxide we have in the atmosphere is a function of excessive amounts of carbon dioxide thanks to anthropogenic change, what human beings are doing. And that carbon budget is something that humanity shares. It's a function of our defined fixed planet, our defined fixed atmosphere, and it is a global public good.
But to cut you here, I agree with carbon. I was not talking about carbon. That's why I was trying to just pinpoint on like sulfur or NOx and those kind of things.
No, it's the specific comment about pollution not being a global public good. That's wrong. It is. Atmospheric.
I mean, local air pollution, like things for, you know, the urban types of aspects.
I think the idea was that local changes sometimes.
Exactly. The idea about whether or not the air or the water is local to one part of the planet is an idea that's been settled from the 1970s. These are global public goods. It's non-negotiable. That's a fact. You know, the reason why we have, you know, international treaties and policy, which you said didn't exist, that affects these local targets is that EU clean air standards cause the congestion charge to exist in central London, causes cars to have to be hybrid or electric, because in Britain, in London, we break the law, EU law, international law, which is setting out the levels of air pollution human beings should be forced to walk through as they go to school or work on a daily basis. And if your issue is carbon, we can talk about plastic pollution in oceans, because again, plastic pollution in oceans is a global political problem. And there are organizations who are talking about this. So that's flat out wrong. And I think what's super important about where we are and where we're going with this is that there's a really important sense of cooperation that's evolving. And we have to talk this up, not talk it down. It isn't fringe, it isn't radical. It's new because the world that we live in and the democratic news flow that we have is tilted away from global public goods, it's tilted away from public goods in general, and tilted towards private profit. Now, having worked as a banker, I can tell you that I'm pro-capitalist, generally speaking, but I don't think capitalism is perfect. I know markets are not perfect. They crash all the time. I know markets don't price things correctly. Externalities exist, and they are massive. And until we understand that, both from a theoretical or academic and a practical position, we don't make policy progress. We do end up with free riders, people who just don't bother to engage. Even more so, we have a bigger free rider problem if the arguments in public are framed in a way that doesn't understand people's needs and doesn't value what comes out of people cooperating and developing a society for all. And it's something I feel really strongly about, because this is the journey that we're on. This is what we're doing. This is when Sortition chooses a group of people and experts advise them on how Britain reaches net zero. They're told about these laws. They're informed about public goods. They're told about corporate interests that might impact politics, but have to be left at the door when you try and work out a balanced human rights basis, when you try and implement environmental rights for citizens. The way in which we make progress is by recognizing the problem in full first and then solving it. And that is non-negotiable.
So kind of following up on this, so I just want to clarify, I think what Eugenie was saying was just that changes even on a local level, regardless of what they're about, are somehow, you might think, are simpler than trying to change how many countries collectively act. And I think the point she was making was that even on a local level, it can be difficult to achieve a solution and to kind of all agree. Correct me if I'm wrong, Eugenie. But
yeah, I mean, so I'm completely, you know, on the same page at Chidi on like global public good and thinking about the atmosphere and clean air, and in particular like a hospitable climate as a global public good. But it is a fact that this idea of like local to global, I mean, so there's a spectrum, and some problems has more like local aspects that are more salient. So in the case of like pollution coming from, driving your car, it's more local, that, the sulfur dioxide that it's emitting or the particulate matter that it's emitting is more of a local problem than the CO2 that particular car in the same plane is emitting. So, and often like these two different things are actually, I agree again with Chidi that these things are in fact, in reality, they are connected. So if we were able to phase out, to deal with the problem of pollution in the transportation sector, we would actually deal with, we would have the climate change. We will also deal with, the local air pollution. But I think local air pollution is not a controversial way of describing that. At least, in academia, but maybe we can agree to disagree here. I'm on the same page as you, Chidi, on like the pricing, the externalities that, that's basically the very simplistic way that economists tend to summarize environmental issues too. Maybe there are other aspects outside the externalities that are complicated, more subtle as well. But on this, I totally agree. I just wanted to go back on another mention when you talked about Brazil, and I think it's nice. It brings things in context. So I thank you for kind of bringing that particular example. And here again, we see that the key issue is a global one. I think we realize that it's difficult to solve this at the global level, on the global stage. Because it's a problem of environment versus development a little bit. So in the case of Brazil, right, it's you would want them to keep their forest. It's just unlucky that European countries have been deforesting their own forest like a long time ago. And so we're in this difficult position where, we are, at least from from Brazil point of view, and that's an argument that Bolsonaro loves to use, right? That it's easy to give lessons where, in fact, the European history has done what Europeans now want a Brazilian not to do. So the global stage is sort of riddled with this conflicts of, providing a space for middle-income countries and lower-income countries to develop, and develop is probably not the right word, but in a more maybe, I guess, fact-based, improving their overall level of well-being. So that's better health, that's better nutrition, that's more consumption in this sense. And I think at the global stage, that's the tricky part, right? Please go ahead.
Low carbon pathways are really important, and it's wonderful that you mentioned it, because low carbon development pathways are an extremely important part of building global consensus on how we go forward in a sustainable way. And I won't tackle you on Bolsonaro because this is a family show and I'm not allowed to swear. But he's a very unusual man. I think he was called the Trump of the South. But we'll leave it there because there are elections coming up and we can always hope. We need to get to the point where everyone, and so I'm of Nigerian descent, and it shouldn't be good to just name and blame. Many countries around the world think of the way that you develop is you cut down the forests. First of all, you pour cement all over it, and you build a nice big skyscraper, and then everything's okay. And we need to share the idea with the world that unitary idea that concrete as development is not sustainable. It's not right. There has to be a different way of looking at the world where we consume things in a different way, and we search for value in a different way. It's super important.
Yeah, I think Philip had a point earlier that he raised his hand. Unfortunately, we forgot about.
No, that's fine. I'm going to be very careful to mention anything or say anything where Chidi is going to attack me, because I definitely don't want to be in that situation that Eugenie was in before. So I'm instead just going to ask a question. Sorry, I'm instead just going to ask a question, which makes it easier and makes me less attackable. I'm going to ask a question to Emily, because I'm just thinking, we're all convinced that things need to happen, and you yourself, you were saying that earlier, and I took lots of notes about this. You were saying you need dialogue to enable you to act. And I find that very interesting, and it just makes me, I think I have partly an answer to this, or partly I think I know perhaps what the issue is, but I'd like to hear that again from you specifically, because you're the only person really at the policy making end of things on the panel. And I would just find it interesting to hear, with all the groups putting pressure onto you, saying, we want zero carbon and all that kind of stuff. What is stopping you from just going and saying, well, we're going to ban cars from this area and we're going to retrofit all these houses now and pour massive amounts of money into public transport, et cetera, et cetera. What's stopping you?
I think there are two things I bring forward there. The first is this concept that actually Extinction Rebellion have been great in bringing to the fore of this just transition. And ensuring that there's an equitable move towards green solutions. And I don't necessarily have an answer to that, other than to say that while really helpful and something that needs to be doing, it does make it more complicated to try and to implement things. So throughout this whole process, we're grappling with how to make this just and fair. In answer to why we don't just go ahead and do stuff, quite honestly, a lot of it is to do with the financing. A lot of, at Cambridgeshire, our projects are based on, we need to have a financial case to do the work. Otherwise, we can't financially justify expenditure, public money. We need to be able to show that we're spending it on is giving a return, particularly when there is, on a grand scale, very little funding available purely for environmental work. Outside of the statutory obligations that local authorities have, there is, the money we have doesn't cover that work, let alone all of this other environmental and climate work that we're trying to do on top of that. And so we have to have a sound business case to enable us to do lots of these works. Things such as some of the renewable energy is slightly more straightforward. You can get a financial return on that project, and so you can make it happen. One thing we're grappling with at the moment is exactly what Chidi has been talking about, is how do you start including these externalities into your business case? We know, for example, that there is going to be a cost to removing carbon from the atmosphere. Indeed, carbon has already been costed. BEIS produces prices that increase over time. But that is not a real financial cost at the moment. And indeed, how, when, for example, air quality, the local authority might be paying for the project, but those potential financial savings that you see from lower use of the NHS, for example, how can that be costed into our financial case when somebody else gets the financial benefit? And indeed, a highly a quantifiable benefit that has a great deal of uncertainty around it. So it's grappling with these issues. So the sort of the mechanics of actually implementing, that is where a lot of the focus is on at the moment. I think what we need is a mechanism to make those costs real. And I know there is work going on at government. They're consulting on carbon tax and those sorts of things that will make those costs real. Who should pay for it? How? What percentage? Where does that payment sit? So again, it's complex, and we want to move faster, but we have to get all of this in line first to enable us to move. Otherwise, we're just going to end up in a bit of a mess in the long run, I think.
Mm-hmm. Do any of you have a particular response to that, perhaps? Maybe Philip, to your question, are you satisfied with the answer?
Have I answered it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's really great. I mean, there are a few points where I can see the kind of the solution or the model that I have presented might also answer that question, where I think there are certain policies or certain restrictions to consumption, for example, that are only going to be implemented if they have enough public support. And in order to get that public support and that trust, you need to engage with the wider public. So that's another issue that has to do with things like, you know, reducing consumption, making people use public transport instead of driving into the city, etc. But yeah, I can see on the other hand side, when it comes to projects that actually just take money, you know, obviously local government is in quite a bit of a problem, and that things might need to happen one level above in terms of the governmental authority. Yeah, sorry, just some, but that was a very helpful answer. Thank you.
If I may, just along with all of that, I think one thing that all of us have picked up on is this narrative we have of the problem and the solution with climate change. I think traditionally we've taken it's a really, really big problem. Everyone needs to do something and do something now and really quickly. And it scares people. And by scaring people, we end up with these polarized views that we've talked about. You've got those people who will deny there's an issue and just become completely disenfranchised. And those people that see it as such a big issue that you're not quite sure what to do. And you see, this is where sort of the motivation, I think, of, you know, why people end up protesting rather than necessarily trying to do something themselves, because they're not, it's such a big issue that how can the individual affect meaningful change? I think one of the things we need to start bringing forward is to change the discussion overall, to empower the individual. And I think part of that will be to do with reframing the challenge, rather than talking in terms of, oh, the world's going to end, recycle your yogurt pots. We need to make the challenge proportionate to the solutions that individuals are able to implement themselves. And in doing that, it will empower. So some of Chidi's things, putting forward about, you know, the various R's, the recycling, the reusing, the repurposing, all of this feels small fry when you're talking about needing to reach net zero, for example. However, if you talk about it from, you know, what target can you set yourself as an individual, and with the understanding that there's a collective contribution, that I think will empower people to feel that they can have more of a change by themselves than some of the traditional narrative might be putting forward.
Mm-hmm. No, that's really interesting, and also ties into some of the questions that we had on the chat earlier about how to engage people that, you know, the majority, 95% of the people that you were saying, who maybe won't be as engaged. And the fact that, you know, a lot of people still vote for policies that we know are unsustainable, vote in politicians that actively, you know, denounce climate change being real and so on. And so how we can kind of bridge that gap between kind of engaging those people that don't usually engage in those policies. And that was something that stood out to me as well when listening to your talks earlier, the idea that even as individuals, obviously our individual actions really don't really make that much of an impact if we just look at, you know, our own, let's say, our carbon, I don't know, footprint. Like, okay, you know, there's ways that we can minimize it, but, you know, we've all seen with the pandemic, we've all stayed at home and the global emissions haven't magically disappeared, right? So clearly we need action at a much higher systematic kind of level, and changes at a systematic level to occur. But one thing that I thought was really interesting in your talks was this idea that as individuals, we're not only voters, but we're also consumers, and that we have power through those two mechanisms to kind of put our incentives forward and kind of have our interests represented in ways that maybe aren't immediately as clear. And Emily, you were saying at the beginning of your talk how there were these mechanisms, there were these ways in which the city council tried to reach out to people to hear about, you know, what do you want us to do about climate? Let's sit down and talk about it. But do you think that maybe people just don't know that these kind of initiatives already exist, and perhaps, you know, we were kind of reinventing the wheel in the sense that at a local scale, at least, there might be ways for people to actually inform policymaking in a very short-term, very tangible manner, but that people just don't know about, or, you know, they don't think that writing to their local, I don't know, climate change officer is going to make a difference, and so on.
I would agree with that. I think, you know, the mechanisms we have aren't perfect, and we could do more, but we get quite regularly told, if you want to engage certain groups of people, get onto social media, get onto your Instagram and TikTok, all of these things as routes through. The problem is that unless that individual likes us or follows us on Facebook, Twitter, any of these platforms, they're not going to see what we're putting out anyway. So there's this initial hurdle that we really haven't got a proper handle on yet, I don't think, of how do we make people, want to engage to the local authority that is there putting up highway signs and filling potholes, and how do we make them want to speak to us in the first place before we even talk about what the actual content of the discussion needs to be. And I can't say I've got a solution to that one at the moment, so I'd be really interested to hear what others have to say on this.
Chidi, do you want to respond?
Sorry, did you say me or Chidi? I think Chidi.
I think I said Chidi because he raised his hand.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
I'm so sorry, I was having difficulty unmuting myself. Thank you for that, Emily. And you're right about building trust and creating those communication channels. That is part of the work. But when you spoke and I said that I was really impressed with the work that you were doing, I meant it from an experiential perspective, because not all local authorities are as good as yours appear to be. So because we're talking about social media, if you scroll down my Instagram page, you'll see that last year I attended Corporation of London. I live in central London and I used to work in the city, so I attended a Corporation of London meeting to ask them to declare a climate change emergency. And it was a public meeting and there were about 30 councillors there. And I was the only member of the public who showed up, because we in London and probably many parts of the country, we know that certain local authorities are not as forward-looking as yours is. And people disengage on a whole range of topics, not just climate change. And as soon as I made the request and I put a paper, one sheet of A4, out to all of the councillors, I was told that the meeting had suddenly become a private one and not a public one, and I should think about leaving and making an appointment and coming back. I did. And when I returned, I was told that the meeting had been shortened magically from 2 hours to 15 minutes, and that I should make another appointment and consider coming back. The Corporation of London has still not declared formally a climate change emergency. What they've done is they put out a paper that they had a group of consultants write, talking about how they're going to change their behavior. And I like to think, in my own slightly egotistical way, that having this man, me, show up to meetings waving pieces of paper was one of the reasons why they did it. And I'm here to engage, and there'll be others to engage, but I think that it's super important to have willing parties like you, Emily, meet up with other willing parties. It's the magic of both sides working together rather than one or the other. And when you talk about individuals, setting recycling targets for themselves, I wanted to say local authorities have recycling targets. Those should be made a lot more stringent. Those should be published. Those should be followed. Because if we have that at local or national level, I wager that's actually a slightly more effective way of cutting pollution than asking individuals to do it.
Okay, in response to that, if I may, I would say recycling targets are a really good example of where, the target sits with us. However, the individuals need to put the item in the recycling box to start with. Otherwise, it won't affect the recycling rate. So you're right in that potentially more stringent targets, and not to say we aren't open about the targets, but publicizing them potentially a little bit more is beneficial, but there's still that behavioral change on the individual level that needs to take place. And I think that's the challenge we really need to grapple with, is you as an individual, you, the collective you, being or seeing what their individual actions doing and how that contributes to the bigger picture. And I think that would then become a powerful message.
I was going to say that I think Philip also wanted to respond to this point.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I mean, one point I was going to make is I don't think is the right solution to always think, oh, we just need to engage with all these people and make them follow our Twitter account and our Instagram account and so on. I think if the county council or the city council or whoever is seriously thinking that people are going to be so interested to follow them on their social media account, I think that's really unrealistic. And, you know, don't get me wrong. I mean, by all means, please try and please engage with people. But I think there has to be a paradigm shift in terms of how do we communicate with people? Do we really think that this kind of this level of interest to you know, actively come forward to your local council and tell them what's going wrong is going to work, and especially with those types of people who don't normally engage. So I mean, even when you get engagement from people, it's usually from the same type of people. That's the other problem. And I mean, you know, I don't want to oversell my method here today, but I'm kind of here to represent it to some extent. So I think the idea really is that a citizens' assembly, or, you know, public mini publics, deliberative mini publics, the point is not only that, yeah, you get more trust and you get more I don't know, engagement from certain groups of people. I think it's just so much more efficient, because I mean, if you think about every person constantly kind of engaging with public policy and engaging with their local councils about filling a pothole or something, I think it just makes so much sense to outsource this job of feeding back to your local council about this whole thing, about this problem. It's just so much more efficient when you do it through citizens' assembly. Then you just put out a call, a public call for, hey, please, will you give us your feedback? I don't know if you understand my point, but I've spoken to some people who said, I'm happy to give up 2 weekends of my time, I don't know, every 2 years or something, and then actually provide some real valuable feedback to the city council, but then not be involved with it for the next 2 years and not bother with it. So I don't know if you can see the point of more efficient communication in this as well.
I think that's a really interesting point you highlight, this perspective that actually, you know, people might prefer to go sort of all in for a few weeks and then do nothing else, rather than take part in surveys, and potentially this view that we also need to somehow deal with, that taking part in the consultation isn't worthwhile, and that it will take an event, if you like, you know, the citizens' assembly, so a thing that's happening specifically to hear from people, to make them feel that their view is being heard. So say, I take your point, but I think it raises other challenges with all the things we've been talking about, really.
Mm-hmm. Kind of bringing the discussion back to the changes themselves. So even, let's say, you know, for a second, we have this fantastic world where everybody is engaged with these issues and we can talk to people about what they're interested in. I was interested in kind of what the changes that we could be advocating for, what those could look like. So Eugenie, your research is looking at kind of how different institutions affect, you know, how we might be able to influence the transition to like a more green kind of future. And I wonder if you could weigh in on highlighting maybe some of those mechanisms that, you know, we might be able to influence.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been said before, right? I mean, as long as the incentives are not right, and as long as there are incentives to pollute, because you make more profit when you pollute than when you don't pollute, then, you know, we're not gonna get much done there. So there are different policies that can kind of fix the incentives here. You know, you can think of tax, you can think of a cap and trade, but you know, if we are trying to be closer to what's going on right now with, you know, how the Paris Agreement is being translated, people are trying to translate the Paris Agreement in national level policies, or to enshrine it into domestic law, right? So you have this net zero targets that governments are announcing. And I think it's not clear how, the full mechanism on how we get to this net zero carbon, net zero targets is actually not 100% clear. And I think this is where, as informed and engaged citizen is going to be useful, trying to understand how each of these sectors, or actually what kind of progress the different sectors involved are going to be able to make. It's not, there's a constellation of policy. Different economies, different politicians will, push forward different policies. So there is a sort of variation on the political spectrum. You have heard from things like the Green New Deal, for example, that is what economists would call more like command and control. Like suggesting, banning and, banning some substances would be an example of a command and control. Economists are more, typically more in favor of, pricing policy, because prices are, in the most, in the purest way, they are setting signals, right? They're aligning incentives, but it is true that sometimes, there are no perfect instruments. And I think there's a strong case for having a combination of policies. But we'll have to look very carefully what's happening in the coming 10 years and exactly how emission reduction in, every single sectors are going to be achieved. And I think the mechanism are not entirely clear. It's going to be a combination of, more decentralized and more centralized action.
We had a question from the chat where someone asked about this isn't assemblies, but kind of at a more national and global issue, level, if any of you thought that there's a future for more regular forms of kind of direct democracy. So maybe not necessarily citizens' assemblies, but I guess kind of focused groups or somehow. There's probably many mechanisms to have that. I think the person was saying also.
Can I jump in about this local global aspect? Because when I was listening to the conversation on recycling, and it strikes me that here again we have a problem of international cooperation, or at least a problem that where the main channel is trade. As you may know, actually, in the UK, there's no facilities that can really recycle anything, so the waste is being exported, and it's exported to countries that don't really recycle. There's a problem in the supply chain of recycling. And of course, this happened because it's cheaper to export this waste than actually recycling it. So here again, it's a problem that the incentives are not right. We have incentives to do the cheapest thing here because the pollution part is not being internalized. If we were to price, basically down the line, the plastic the waste being exported end up in the ocean, right? So most of your recycling, a big part, I don't have the numbers, don't quote me on that, but a big part of actually what we think is being recycled that is not. And it is an international problem because it's about global trade and exactly the externalities that happen along the supply chain. And that is a conversation that needs to happen across countries. It's difficult for localities to deal with that. If they are not armed, if they don't have much leverage on that. So I know this is not a nice thing to say, because I would like to come up with ways that individuals, that everyone, citizen lambda, can make a difference, but I spend most of my day thinking about problems that are at a global stage, right? And it's really challenging. That is why in my initial remarks, I highlighted that it's important to citizens and individuals can still and do have a role to play in how governments enter this global stage negotiations. They need to take this negotiation seriously. They need to know that their citizens back home are expecting them to deliver some concrete results. If they think the negotiations is of no interest to anyone, why would they kind of fight for anything? So again, public debate and pointing fingers at things and mobilizing people's is important.
Chidi, you wanted to respond?
Sure. I just wanted to say again, Eugenie, I have so much respect for the perspective that you bring on these things, because having a global and academic perspective is incredibly important. But I've been really lucky in that I've worked with some incredible activists and actual policymakers and politicians. It doesn't say so in my bio. I ran for parliament a few years ago here in Britain, and the quality of civil servants in Britain is outstanding. It's still incredibly high. And while there are free rider problems in every policy area, in climate, very recently, what has happened is that there is a growing realization that trying to frame the issue of pollution control as something that is either done by individuals on one end of the spectrum or government and corporations on the other end of the spectrum is an incomplete way of framing the problem. I'd actually argue that when you do that, what you do is you pit the demand side, because that's what individuals do. We buy things, we are consumers, we buy things from large corporations. You pit the demand side against the supply side, because that's what corporations do. They organize themselves to produce things. And when you do that, when you pit the demand side against the supply side, you claim that market clearing prices are arrived at and there's an efficient allocation of resources. And when you say stop, there are externalities. How do we deal with those externalities? Now, because you've pitched individuals versus corporations, you then tend to talk about carbon taxes and transaction costs that you again apply to individuals, the demand side. Think of fuel duty, being charged to people who use polluting cars. Think of the plastic bag tax or price for a plastic bag. These are all very effective policies, but they tend to target the demand side. Whereas if we're going to make lasting, sustainable change, you need to think about ways of changing the supply side, changing ways that corporations fabricate things, changing the ways that corporations and governments treat waste. I mean, you started talking about that, Eugenie, so I'm agreeing with you here. Changing the way that corporations and governments, process waste. I mean, transporting waste, from Europe to China, for example, is grotesque. I mean, it's just ridiculous. The carbon footprint of the transport itself is probably more expensive than the actual waste you're attempting to recycle, which then, of course, gets incinerated when it gets to China. So it isn't actually, it's horrific. The entire value chain is just so wrong. And having that conversation about where that value chain is, who the participants are, what the actual costs are, who is bearing these costs, of course, it's us, the global community, we all bear the cost. Having that conversation is just as important, maybe even more so, than having the conversations about individual choice.
I think we may also be suffering from the fact that, when we came up with this panel, we put the word individuals into the question. And I think the main reason why we chose this theme, I guess, was because often as individuals, who maybe are or maybe aren't interested in sustainability, you often think, well, what can I do? And then you realize that what you can do as just an individual isolated from society, let's say, is very little. So I think the idea was to discuss, okay, what can you do as an individual citizen, but also what can you do as the structures that you're part of? If you're part of an organization, how can you make local changes in your organization or your city or your, province or your state, your country, and so on. So, by mentioning individuals, the idea was to start the discussion on, what we all can take away from this kind of event and what we can go and change individually in our lives or think differently about. But the idea wasn't, to just blame,
No. You framed it beautifully. That framing is excellent because it allows us to have this conversation about whether or not the dichotomy even exists, right? So nothing wrong with the framing. I wanted to use the framing to illustrate the point about the supply side.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and to add on this, I think we're at a stage where everything needs to be on the table. Like, I don't think we can afford picking one way of trying to deal with this problem, right? We're gonna need individual, we're gonna need groups, I don't know, like communities, and then we're gonna need governments of not, democratically elected, and the government of other countries that may not have democracies, and then we're just gonna have to have them sit down at the same table and also debate, the history of inequality across the world, because obviously this is that, as Chidi put it very rightly so at the very beginning, this is all happening in a historical context, right? Where some economies have gotten richer than others earlier than others. And so we are trying to deal at the global level with this problem. And if I wasn't making myself clear as well, I mean, I think that the sort of this bottom-up individual work that is being done by activist organization and any sort of NGOs, environmental NGOs, is really important. Even like pointing finger, like this experience that you told us about, Chidi, that you go to this meeting and just you being there and showing a little sign, actually, it pushes people. It sets a bit more pressure. And so, of course, if there was a little bit more of that, and I mean, and what I love about that is like, it's peaceful, it's non-violent, it's just like, it's increasing the saliency of some sort of information, right? We live in the world of, we're overwhelmed with all the information that's around us. And so we're going to have to strategically increase the saliency of some facts in front of some policymakers at the right moments. And I think, yeah, activism from the roots, from like grassroots activism, serve that functions and helps the the not so individual level of the problem, which is getting policymakers to do their job.
One thing that I think, Chidi, you ended with in your original talk was how we need to create, I think your words were, we need to create a situation where people can make effective choices. And I thought that was a really interesting way of summarizing kind of what we were all discussing. And also, Philip, you also talked about in your Citizens Assembly summary about how they work, how you bring these people together who may or may not like have previously thought about this, and then you make them focus on this particular topic, and you kind of create that environment for those choices to exist. And I just wondered if you could comment a bit on, even when you do create that space where you're like, okay, we're going to bring these people, we're going to bring the facts, and we're just going to sit down and talk about it, how the kind of mechanisms for trust between citizens or just random people and science or policymakers and so on, how that translates to those focus groups. Because you might imagine that if someone's typically very distrustful of climate scientists, or thinks that there's an agenda in the global science community, for instance, or in all politicians or in their local community, how we might be able to tackle those issues on a larger scale. Because I assume that if you're able to kind of get around those initial, not necessarily biases, but the kind of prejudice that people might have, or their initial thoughts and preconceptions about different actors, and if you're able to kind of overcome those at a small scale in the Citizens Assembly, I wondered if you have any kind of lessons that you've learned from that experience that could be useful for all of us in, whether it's science, government, policy, activism, and so on. And if so, if you could share them with us.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a very, very excellent question. And I think Edward Lee in the chat asked a question that was quite similar, actually, I think, earlier. I mean, the essential question is, if we create a space like a Citizens Assembly, a deliberative mini-public, whatever you want to call it. So the idea is that these people are supposed to kind of represent society in making decisions on that particular topic. So you bring in a representative group of people, you feed them all the information, and you ask them, what would you do in this context? Now, the question is, once you've got this recommendation, how does it get implemented? And we have seen many examples where it has been implemented and it has worked. Some of the best examples are probably from Ireland on abortion and on same-sex marriage. These have been really great examples. It's been a very good combination of running one of these mini publics, one of these citizens' assemblies, along with a referendum, which I think worked together quite nicely to make sure that the whole of the population was aware, at least to some extent, of what was going on in the Citizens Assembly and how it kind of was supposed to represent the deliberation that also in the wider public and kind of steer or guide that conversation. Of course, that's not very easy to create, and it really depends on if you create that space. If you create that space in the citizens' assembly where the experts and the citizens and everyone and the policymakers, they come together to create those solutions. It really depends on good communication and good storytelling of this to the wider public to make them understand what this is all about and why it should be trusted. There are examples in France where the Convention Citoyenne, so the French Climate Convention that was initiated by Macron, that one came forward with really strong climate action plans with really strong recommendations for climate to prevent climate change. And now the president actually realized, oh, I didn't imagine it to be that strong and that ambitious. And now he has to defend himself and his government when they do not implement any of these measures, because everyone has seen that's what a group of everyday people think about this topic. And that's kind of the aim, the thing we're aiming for. But obviously, it's quite hard to get to. The process is relatively, well, it's not new. It's been invented by the ancient Greeks, but still, it's new in the sense that it hasn't been used in our democratic model for some time. But it's a very challenging and very interesting question. Thank you.
And if Emily, you have any responses to that as someone who deals with, change at the local level?
I think it's really interesting points, and you're completely right. The concept of the citizens' assembly, juries' assembly, all the multitude of different names is by no means new. I think one of the challenges is that up until fairly recently, the concept's generally been put forward as a mechanism by those at either end of the spectrum. I don't want to say extreme views, but that's tantamount to what we're putting towards. And so one of the reasons that it's challenging to justify putting forward a citizens' assembly, I think, is that for some people, they see it as undermining our democratic system that they are very proud of and feel very impassioned about. So how we have make it clear that it's done in a complementary way, not instead of, is key. And I think is something that lots of local authorities are grappling with. And alongside that, figuring out exactly what question it is we need to ask to get the type of answers that we need to help us act on them. A couple of reasons why citizens' assemblies aren't necessarily the norm yet, but I think, as you've alluded to, certainly when we've got particularly challenging questions that, it's climate change at the core, but actually it's all of this other surrounding the implications of it. That's where they become really useful, because on the one hand, you just get this simple base level of people think in silos quite often. And so if we open up this conversation that actually climate change impacts air quality, which impacts health, which impacts the ability for the NHS to do its job, once you start demonstrating that all of this thing has knock-on effects, you can start to reach people that don't necessarily think, the climate's changing. You can be completely anti the concept of climate change, but still see that doing something about air quality is beneficial for other reasons. And so you can get lots of people involved in action for all sorts of different reasons, but still get the outcome that delivers on what you're trying to achieve.
And I guess this ties into what we were saying, what I think Chidi was saying earlier about shifting the, not necessarily responsibility, but kind of putting more responsibility or accountability, let's say, with institutions to change. And perhaps if we see specific metrics that matter to us in terms of the ways that we can evaluate our lives, the air quality, our health, and so on, I think it's easier perhaps for people to even picture what that is, instead of when people say, 50 metric tons of carbon dioxide, like what is that?
Yeah.
Whereas if you see the impacts to your NHS, how that's going to affect your daily life in a more tangible and like easier to imagine way.
And I think that's exactly right. It's making it tangible rather than, currently climate change is quite an abstract in terms of the impacts. So drilling down into those tangible outcomes that people can then understand why it impacts them more than just, it means we get slightly better weather over the summer. That's great. It's about bringing that together so you can see implications in terms of impact on you or as us as groups or individuals, rather than just being untangible implications, because we can't see climate change, we see the effects of it. And conveying that as a message that then delivers action is at the crux of what we need to do. And that's delivering action by individuals, institutions, the entire spectrum. We have to understand that it does affect us, will affect us more, and the longer we leave it, the harder it'll be to do anything about it. That's the sort of the crux of the issue, really.
Yeah, I was wondering if maybe Chidi, you wanted to respond to that, because as you were saying that obviously you have now also worked with Extinction Rebellion, and you also have worked in activism before, and kind of seeing people in the past few years, I guess, change from like the environmental issues have become maybe something that are more at the forefront of kind of public discourse or whatever you want to call it, and seeing people kind of mobilize on these issues. What do you think has been effective in making that mobilization happen, and what kind of issues do people respond to, I guess?
Thank you for that. That's a really prescient question. So there's always been this tension, both inside and outside of Extinction Rebellion, about effectiveness of an action versus non-effectiveness. So it's the matrix by which we measure how effective an action is varies quite a lot. Extinction Rebellion has something called radical inclusivity. So we have Extinction Rebellion Jews, we have Extinction Rebellion Christians, we have Extinction Rebellion Muslims, we have Extinction Rebellion's group in different regions and different countries, we have Extinction Rebellion lawyers, we have Extinction Rebellion doctors. And the beautiful thing about when you get involved in these kinds of teams is, as people find their tribes, their groups, you hear the language of change being spoken from different perspectives. And it's actually really beautiful. I don't know what other word to use, but it's so enlightening and so enriching when you hear people join the dots, because our ecology, our planet, is like a spider's web. You pull one bit and all the other things that are attached move, just a little bit sometimes, but a lot other times. And making that connection is really profoundly important. We all share a space, we all share a planet. And when you watch, a 60-year-old vicar from Worcester sitting on Waterloo Bridge, cry, physical tears, because she's deeply worried that she spent 40 years of her life preaching an ideology about development and growth and consumption indirectly, but she's been part of a system that is going to destroy the quality of life of her grandchildren. She's lived a lie. And we're all in this together. I mean, literally, no one's going to go off planet and have fun while Earth destroys itself. We are all in this together. When you see people come together to get this realization that, taking action like gluing yourself onto the front of Lloyd's of London. I know a 21-year-old man who did it. And at the time I was in awe. Just 21 years old, you're surrounded by 6 police officers. Lloyd's of London is several hundred meters high into the sky. It represents trillions of dollars of assets insured. And you have the capacity to use your voice in that way. I found it really moving. So XR gets called out for being radical sometimes, for being a bit loud, for stopping people from getting to work. But you have to weigh it against what XR is arguing about and what really matters to people, to you, to anybody else, and what the results have been. The results have been fora like this one. The results have been, the Parliament, the UK Parliament, the mother of parliaments, on the 1st of May 2019, declaring a climate change emergency. Now, I've been involved in environmentalism for like 10 years. If you told me this was going to happen, I'd never have believed it. I wept. I was sitting in Parliament Square crying on that day because I was just so overcome. I could not believe that we did it. And I think this is just the beginning. I think individuals get together, absolutely abhor violence. It doesn't get anybody anywhere. But hold hands with your fellow man or woman and use your voice. You know, it matters. People do listen. They will hear you eventually. You use your voice.
Thank you. We have some more questions from our YouTube channel, apparently. And I guess this is we can make this a maybe more broader question, but the idea that I think a lot of the change that we think about initially is about kind of mitigating climate change, or what we can do to stop kind of the impacts being so bad. But what about kind of adaptation to the consequences that we know to some extent we are going to have to deal with? And what can we do kind of to focus on those? Or is it maybe time to kind of introduce that into the discussion as well? Or do you think that there should be a balance between those two, the mitigation and also the adaptation? Or I don't know if any of you have any thoughts?
That is an awesome question. That is a really, really good question. The challenge with a global problem like climate change is that it works on averages. So 1.5 degrees doesn't mean that everybody's summer gets just a little bit warmer. It means that certain parts of the planet get turned into desert and other parts of the planet get flooded. It means that you have really unpredictable rises in temperature, in wind speed, in precipitation. It means you get climate crises more than just warming. Now, what that means then is that in different places, you emphasize mitigation versus adaptation differently, in different ways. So coastal communities, including islands in the Pacific, are all focused on adaptation. They need different infrastructure. They need to build, wave defenses, flood defenses. Some islands are being vacated because sea level rises mean that they won't be able to last a generation. Whereas in other places, you can take mitigating steps, not adapting steps. You can convert to renewable energy. You can build lifestyles that have different types of agriculture to take account of different types of precipitation. You can, and this is really crucial, educate the next generation on the changes they may need to make and the kind of world they need to live in and the kind of behaviors that are necessary for you to have sustainable societies going forward. So I think that it's a spectacular question because it then calls into full view the fact that everything is contextual. Different places have to act in different ways to try to get sustainability.
Mm-hmm. Eugenie, do you have a response to that?
No, I mean, I think if I were trying to summarize what Chidi said is like, I mean, in the UK, the main problem is mitigation because we're emitting a lot. And if you go to countries that, Mali or Niger, well, the problem is not about mitigation, right? The problem is going to be about adaptation. So I think, yeah, the saliency of these issues is very different across the world. It makes sense that the Citizen Assembly focus on mitigation. That's what countries in Europe, in the US, North America have to deal with. But of course, like there are problems of floods and fires in rich countries as well. But there are systems in place that are actually already kind of active about that. So it's less of the problem. That's why they're focusing on mitigation. I mean, it makes sense to me at least.
I think on that, if I may, I agree with both in that obviously, in the UK, for example, it is right that the primary focus is on mitigation. But one of the advantages when we look at adaptation is because there's a multitude of co-benefits that come with it. For example, if you're looking at reducing flood risk, you can do sustainable drainage systems, which integrate green approaches, trees, and all of these other things that end up very much the nature-based solutions. And if we can integrate that alongside our mitigation, I think we will end up with a far more balanced system at the end of the day. And that's really what we want to achieve, I think, particularly if you look at, we could mitigate all we want. But at the same time, if we're then building the sea wall even higher with loads of concrete, that isn't the final solution. We want the ways to adapt to the changes that we're seeing already in a way that brings forward all of these other solutions and benefits that adaptation is a really strong mechanism to realize. So I think there's certainly a place for both, but I think if you're talking what policy needs to focus on today, it's the mitigation. I think, I don't want to say once we've got a handle on that, because it's a huge challenge, but I think further down the line, we will certainly see a prominent shift towards the adaptation. I think it's going to come. And if we can be in a position where we're more set to implement than we have been with mitigation approaches, that will be a very good day.
We have another question, apparently from YouTube as well, on how we can ensure that marginalized voices are heard when discussing things around climate change, and how we can diversify kind of the people that we listen to and treat as experts and so on in these discussions. And I think it also links to what we already identified as, well, I mean, I think what Eugenie was saying about how, depending on what country you live in, there might be different immediate priorities when it comes to adaptation or mitigation of kind of the consequences that, like Europe and the US and China as well have kind of these problems that we've created from industrializing really fast in a very non-sustainable way. And now we're like, oh wait, this is a bad way of doing things. Please don't do them this way. But that comes at an economic cost, and that comes from like it's our responsibility to deal with it. But then the consequences affect everyone. So I guess how kind of turned the question to something that it wasn't. But I guess how can we ensure that we bring everybody into that discussion and not just keep the dominant voices that might be the loudest? Only listen to those.
Well, Philip is providing a solution, right?
I mean, I can just maybe quickly share some stories about this. So what we do when we invite people to participate in a citizens jury or a citizens assembly, we send out random invitations to random households across the country. And quite often what we've heard from people is that when they first received a letter, I can actually show you what they look like. When they receive one of these letters that say, the Parliament has invited you to come to this event and give feedback, what most people are going to say is, that can't be right. I mean, they probably just must have done a mistake there. That can't be true. Because what people then literally say is, government doesn't normally include or ask people like me. So they themselves already perceive themselves as the type of person who does not engage with politics. So they are already aware that they are, they're not the type of person to take part in political debate. And as such, they are so confused by actually receiving that personal invitation to be part of such a process. Luckily, most of people actually do realize it's not a fake. And do respond to us and say, well, actually, now that you're saying it, yeah, why not? I've never done something like that before. Some of them say, well, I've not even voted ever in my life. But yeah, sure, fair enough. I'm going to give you my honest opinion if you really want to hear it. And so that's the way how we diversify the views of people. And it's just actually so interesting to hear from people who normally don't speak up, because their views in some ways are just so different from what we normally hear from in our kind of own personal social bubbles. I mean, obviously, one problem that we have with a citizens' assembly process is it only works when it is connected to power. And that means if it's run by a government or by parliament, as it's happened in the UK and in France, and currently being delivered in Scotland and Denmark and Spain and other places, that's great. But obviously on a global level, currently that's not possible. I mean, some people are talking about this. Do we need a global climate assembly with the UN or something? It's an interesting idea, but unfortunately, there is just no global authority to help those people to gain a louder voice. Climate activists have, of course, tried to establish this by pointing very specifically at those countries who will be adversely affected by climate change and saying, you know, you should really think about those people whose homes will be flooded and all the islands that are going to sink in the ocean, etc. And it's a very strong message, but of course, yeah, there's only that much we can do on that side. Yeah. Thank you.
I don't know if Chidi, maybe you want to respond in terms of the role that maybe activism can play.
Yeah, I think it's demonstrably positive for people to participate in politics. And activism is in my opinion, just, sign of a really good, strong, healthy democracy playing itself out. And within that context, writing letters, putting up signs, having meetings, and being active on social media, all of those things serve to reinforce the understanding that the free rider problem of people not engaging or being interested is a function of the information profile that people live with. If you're told that certain things don't matter as a child, you go up into an adult who doesn't care about them, as a voter, you'll be a free rider. You will not ask candidates about it. You'll engage with candidates who talk about it. And so the way you correct the free rider problem, the lack of participation, is you have to change the informational base people are dealing with, which is why, climate change deniers are so damaging to the fabric of society. And it isn't that they're damaging because their opinion is different. It's that they're damaging because via the corporate backers they have with a vested interests in never implementing a polluter pays principle, they create disinformation that warps our democracy in a substantial way. So if fossil fuel companies can, and they did, withhold research for years that shows that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is going to be unsustainably high over the next few decades if we carry on using their products, that's bad. And activists should call them out on that. Because what activism does, if you like, is it balances out. It's a David and Goliath fight, don't get me wrong. We're not anywhere near as strong as the opposition is, but it comes a little way, a really small way, to balancing out the cacophony of noise about climate science, which is largely settled. But you still have think tanks in places like Tufton Street in London, and certainly they're even more active in Washington and the US, who put out papers that obfuscate facts. They just make things intransparent. And without banging the drum of XR too hard, the first demand of XR is that everybody tells the truth, especially policymakers. And I think that's beautiful. I really do. I think it's super important.
So I guess we're kind of coming to the end of the discussion. I want to say if anyone has any final questions, now is the time to post them on the chat. But in the meantime, I noticed that, you all took a lot of notes in each other's talk. So I wondered if you had any questions to each other that maybe haven't been addressed yet, to feel free to do so now.
Okay, I have a few, but I'm gonna just ask only one, and it's for Emily. And Emily, have you? There's a whole bunch of organizations who are trying to coordinate climate change emergency declarations at local authority level, so that I don't use this phrase too much, so that literally you can find your tribe, you can find other local authorities who are doing climate change. Have you spoken to Climate Change Emergency UK or any of the other ones? I could also connect you to those if you need help.
I don't know. Oh, I am muted. Yes, I don't know about us necessarily directly engaging yet. Certainly, it is on the to-do list, if you like. The likes of Climate Emergency UK, for example, they are groups that we've spoken to in terms of the hey guys, we're declaring emergency type conversation, and certainly when they've been involved in holding events, etc., we attend when we can and that sort of thing. As you allude to, I think there are increasing numbers of platforms that are being developed to bring together local authorities that have declared climate emergencies. And some of them, I think, are really, really positive, focusing on the solutions-led approach. And that is certainly somewhere we are looking to develop our conversations with. It's a capacity issue at the moment, for being totally honest. We end up having to decide essentially between implementing the stuff or engaging in the comms and the sharing of learning about things. Ideally, they would both want to happen at the same time, but it is challenging, and certainly something that is on our radar.
Fantastic. So I think we have to wrap up. But I wondered, in a very, very brief manner, if you could all give us some kind of takeaway messages from your experience here. So maybe Eugenie, do you want to start? Because I know you're in a rush.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that's no, it was really an enlightening conversation. So I really just want to, thank you, thank everyone. I think for me the bottom line is we need every possible ways, every possible tools on the table, and also every type of person of every possible opinions and with different approaches to be willing to talk. And I think everyone's kind of in the same mood tonight, so at least it makes me feel optimistic.
Maybe Philip, do you want to give us your final statement?
Yeah, I'm just gonna echo what Eugenie just said. It was a fantastic evening. It was a very interesting conversation. I learned a lot from all the other panelists and from the questions you asked, and it's very interesting. Thanks so much for organizing this and for just having me here. It was great, amazing.
Thanks. Chidi?
Thanks very much, Simone, and thank you for organizing this. This was outstanding. It's always difficult to pitch these things right, because the last thing you want is to meet former members of the public and then spend an hour talking to them about externalities and free rider problems and the heuristic nature of the limitations of democratic representation. But it's always nice when you meet people who are informed enough for you to be able to have these wonky jargon-filled conversations, and it still kind of rolls along really nicely. But I think that's because your facilitation was so good, Simone. So thank you. I'm very grateful. Thanks for the invite.
And finally, Emily?
Yep, I would echo what all of the other panelists have said. It's been a great event. And I think what's really lovely is that we've got some quite different views on the panel, but ultimately we've demonstrated, I think, that more or less we're on the same page. We want ultimately the same thing. And it's really encouraging to see the commonalities rather than focusing on what's different about the different mechanisms that we might put forward. So that's really lovely. And I hope for everyone watching, it's provides some insight into the different perspectives and the nuances and challenges that we have to grapple with in trying to bring together pretty much anything related to acting on climate and the environment.
Yeah, well, thank you all for joining and for being here for 2 hours. So yeah, I mean, it's been a pleasure to hear what you all had to say, and I'm sure the audience agrees. And yeah, just thank you all for a great event. In terms of the audience who's still around, feel free to tune in tomorrow for when we're going to be talking about the role of academia specifically. And then we also have a careers event where people that are interested maybe in participating in kind of policy internships and understanding a bit more about how as scientists they can get involved with policy, kind of the opportunities that you might have. So feel free to register for that on Eventbrite, and we'll obviously we won't be streaming the careers on YouTube because it'll be in breakout rooms, but register for that. It should be quite fun. And yeah, so if there's no more remarks or questions, I think we can be done. So yeah, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. Take care.